There's currently a lot of misinformation flying back and forth between trans advocates who argue that it's necessary to seek social, legal and medical transition to be considered transgender, and those who claim gender is a spectrum of identities rather than a binary. One group is more associated with the alternative right, anti-feminist, the other is more associated with liberal feminism, or what you might call the regressive left, and social justice warriors. So I want to clarify the current diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria according to the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5, which is unique for children and adults respectively. Who are the American Psychiatric Association? They create the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders for reference by psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are trained up as medical doctors and then they specialise in psychiatry. The APA now encompasses members practising in more than 100 countries, and that includes the UK DSM-5, which is the current edition of the manual. It introduced substantial changes to the DSM, including changing the name from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, giving it its own chapter. First off, I think it's worth noting what terms they've listed definitions for: gender, assigned gender, gender atypical, gender non-conforming, gender reassignment, gender identity, gender dysphoria, transgender, transsexual, genderqueer, gender fluidity, agendered, cisgender, gender expansiveness, and gender expression. As you can see, they haven't deemed sex to be relevant enough to provide a definition, so I'm just going to give a standard definition of biological sex myself. The structural and functional characteristics of a person or organism that allows assignment as either male or female. Sex is determined by chromosomes, hormones, external and internal genitalia. Here's the APA's definition of gender. Denotes the public and usually legally recognised live role as a boy or a girl, man or woman. So the APA's definition of gender suggests that it is socially constructed, given that law is a human social construct, as are social roles. But then there is a note which references biological factors underneath. No concrete indication is given as to how biological factors could be a predictor for gender when they're supposed to be varying independently of reproductive sex in this context. Their definition, assigned gender, refers to a person's initial assignment as male or female at birth. It is based on a child's genitalia and other visible sex characteristics. They're using assigned gender and sex interchangeably, although in their definition of gender, obviously they're not using them interchangeably because they're also referring to social and psychological factors. And it's important to recognise here that gender has the attributes masculine and feminine, whereas sex has the attributes male and female. Because when you use these terms interchangeably, given that all aspects of sex are determined by biology, it becomes very difficult to decouple them when you need to refer to sociological and psychological aspects of gender. So first we'll look at the APA's diagnostic criteria for children, which looks at pre-adolescent children, any age between 2 and when a child starts puberty. Then different criteria is applied in children. Gender dysphoria diagnosis involves at least 6 of the following, and an associated significant distress or impairment in function lasting 6 months. 6 of these, right? Not all 8, 6. 1. A strong desire to be of the other gender, or an insistence that one is the other gender. A strong desire to be of the other gender would be the public and usually legally recognised lived role as a boy or a girl in this case. Bear in mind, this is for kids as young as 2. Number 2, a strong preference for wearing clothes typical of the opposite gender. Number 3, a strong preference for cross-gender roles in make-believe play or fantasy play. A strong preference for the toys, games and activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. Why aren't the roles in make-believe play or fantasy play activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender? If you tick 4, you would tick 3. So why do they even have 3 in their diagnostic criteria? 5, a strong preference for playmates of the other gender. Again, if you're a female kid who's interested in toys, games and activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender, which includes cross-gender roles in make-believe play or fantasy play, the chances are you're going to want to hang around with the other people who are interested in those too, which is going to be boys. It really seems like there's a lot of overlap in this diagnostic criteria that doesn't make sense. A strong rejection of toys, games and activities typical of one's assigned gender. 7, a strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. That's the dysphoria, okay? But bear in mind, you don't have to have that to get a diagnosis. You could have met 1 to 6. And you also need to bear in mind that if you're into all these things that are associated with the opposite sex and you're a child, once you've become aware of your sexual anatomy divides you from your playmates, you're going to start disliking it. But even so, you wouldn't need to in order to get a diagnosis. A strong desire for the physical sex characteristics which match one's experienced gender. Again, the points that I've made for 7. I think the key points about the diagnostic criteria for pre-adolescent children are that gender as a binary is assumed and that you don't have to have dysphoric feelings about your physical sex characteristics to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria as a pre-adolescent child. Also, the heavy reliance on stereotypes. Despite what they're saying, you could get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria just by being a gender non-conforming child. Obviously, the significant distress has to be there, but a lot of kids do feel significant distress because they'll get bullied for it. And bullying is obviously distressing for children. So you've got to question why they're pathologizing this childhood behavior. Now we can look at the APA's diagnostic criteria for adolescents and adults. In adolescents and adults, gender dysphoria diagnosis involves difference between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender, and significant distress or problems functioning. It lasts at least 6 months and it's shown by at least 2 of the following. So not 6, 2. A marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and primary and or secondary sex characteristics. So what that's saying is an inconsistency between how you express or how you experience gender and your primary sex organs, which is your internal or external genitalia, and or your secondary sex characteristics, which is the sex characteristics that emerge during puberty. So that's number 1. The thing to notice about it is it's an incongruence, but it doesn't refer to the other gender. So this could actually apply to people who self-define as agender or non-binary. Number 2, a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics. Again, this could easily apply to people who self-define as agender or non-binary. If you search the terms non-binary and top surgery on YouTube, you'll see videos by young women who are talking about having their breasts removed because they're uncomfortable with them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they want to be seen as male. It just means that they are very uncomfortable with their boobs to the point where they want to get rid of them. How many adolescent girls feel comfortable with their secondary sex characteristics? I think pretty much most, if not all, adolescent girls feel uncomfortable with them, to be honest. So it's a bit of a worry that this is in the diagnostic criteria. 3, a strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender. So this is the first time the other gender is referred to in the diagnostic criteria. 4, a strong desire to be of the other gender, so to have the lived role of either a man or a woman, boy or a girl. 5, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender. Something to note about this is that a lot of feminists, or even women that don't refer to themselves as being feminists, could very easily tick 1 and 5 and get a diagnosis for gender dysphoria. So what's that about? Number 6, a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. So not the truth that one does have the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender, it's just a conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. So that's it in a nutshell. The key thing to notice here, I guess, is that you could be a non-binary adolescent or adult and get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and you also would not necessarily need to want to be rid of your primary or secondary sex characteristics to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So those are the two key points. Let's look at what treatment is recommended for people who have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, just to confirm that that's consistent with what I'm saying. Treatment options for gender dysphoria include counselling, cross-sex hormones, puberty suppression, and gender reassignment surgery. Some adults may have a strong desire to be of a different gender and to be treated as a different gender without seeking medical treatment or altering their body. They may only want support to feel comfortable in their gender identity. Others may want more extensive treatment, including hormone treatment and gender reassignment surgery, leading to a transition to the opposite sex. Some may choose hormone treatment or surgery alone. So you don't need to have a desire to have surgery or hormones in order to be considered transgender by the APA. They've got a section on preferred gender pronouns. Some transgender and gender non-conforming people may prefer gender neutral or gender inclusive pronouns when talking about them. They and their are sometimes used as gender neutral singular pronouns. Singular gender neutral pronouns also include ze and here. Their blurb at the beginning, what is gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria involves a conflict between a person's physical and assigned gender and the gender which he, she, they identify. People with gender dysphoria may be uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned, sometimes described as being uncomfortable with their body, particularly developments during puberty, or being uncomfortable with their expected roles and assigned gender. What kid, especially female kid, is comfortable with their body during puberty? And feminists obviously aren't comfortable with the expected roles of their assigned gender, because otherwise they wouldn't be feminists, would they? So it's quite bizarre that you've got people running around calling themselves feminists and defending this nonsense. But you do. So that's just the way it is. And it seems like in this case the special snowflakes are backed by the APA. So the anti-feminists can run around screaming science all they want, but their claim that there's only two genders are not supported by the APA. The two genders debate is a bit of a red herring, so the next thing is to look at why that is.